The land deed had been folded and unfolded so many times that the creases had worn soft as cloth, and Henry Whitaker kept it in his breast pocket like a man who carries a wound he cannot stop touching. It was the spring of 1874 when Henry Whitaker rode onto the 320 acres of flat Kansas grassland that the government said belonged to him, and he sat his horse for a long time without moving, looking out at the brown and pale green expanse that reached in every direction to meet a sky so wide it made a man feel small in ways that were not entirely comfortable. The land was his. He had earned it in the only way a man of his background could earn anything, through years of punishing work on other men's spreads, through calloused hands and bent backs and wages, saved with the discipline of someone who has learned not to want anything too badly, because wanting things leads only to disappointment. He had driven cattle from Texas to Abilene twice in the years just after the war, had broken horses for a rancher outside of Wichita, had spent 2 winters as a line rider patrolling fence lines through cold that bit through every layer of clothing a man could reasonably wear. And now he had the land, 160 acres claimed under the Homestead Act, and another 160 purchased outright with every dollar he had managed to hold onto. He was 31 years old and he had nothing else. His horse, a solid bay gelding he called Sergeant, shifted beneath him and blew a breath through his nose as if sharing some private opinion about the whole situation. Henry touched the deed through the fabric of his shirt without thinking, a habit he had developed the way a man develops habits when he has been alone too long. Then he clicked his tongue and rode toward the low rise in the middle distance where a creek cut through the property and where he planned to build. Henry Whitaker was not a man who spoke much about himself, which was partly temperament and partly the fact that there was no one around to speak to. He had no family left that he knew the whereabouts of. His mother had died of fever when he was 14. His father had drifted west after that and simply stopped sending letters, and whatever siblings might have existed in some theoretical earlier version of his life had scattered like seeds in wind. He had grown up finishing his childhood in other people's households, working for his keep, and somewhere in those years, the habit of self-sufficiency had calcified into something that looked from the outside like solitude, but felt from the inside like a kind of emptiness he had learned not to examine too closely. The land was meant to fix that. He was not sure how exactly, but the idea had been clear enough in the abstract. A man with his own land had something, was something, occupied a specific place in the world that could not be taken away. That was the theory. The reality of standing on the empty grass in the spring wind with no house, no crop, no livestock beyond Sergeant and 2 mules, was that the land felt less like a destination than like a new and very large version of the same emptiness he had been carrying around in his chest since he was 14 years old. He unpacked his tools and his bedroll and a canvas shelter he could string between the mules if rain came, and he got to work. The nearest town was Caldwell, a growing settlement 20 miles to the southwest that served as a cattle shipping point and possessed, in that particular year, 2 general stores, a livery, a land office, a doctor who had come west for his health and stayed because the town kept growing, 3 saloons, a church that shared its building with the schoolhouse on alternating days, and a population that swelled dramatically during cattle season and contracted just as dramatically when the drives ended. Henry rode into Caldwell every 2 weeks or so to collect supplies and check at the post office for correspondence he almost never received, and on those trips he spoke to people the way a man speaks when human conversation has become something slightly foreign to him, with careful courtesy and a brevity that some people read as coldness and others read as simple straightforwardness. It was at the Caldwell land office, on a Tuesday morning in late April, that Henry Whitaker first encountered the situation that would change everything, though he did not know it at the time and would not have believed you if you told him. He was there to file a supplementary document about his water rights. There had been some confusion with a neighboring claimant named Doster who kept asserting that the creek that ran through Henry's property was actually his creek, a claim Henry was contesting with the patience of a man who has learned that certain battles are won by outlasting the opposition. The land office smelled of paper and linseed oil, and the faint ghost of tobacco that never quite left any building where men gathered to conduct business. The clerk, a thin man named Peters who wore his spectacles pushed up on his forehead more often than on his nose, was engaged with another customer when Henry arrived, so Henry settled himself onto the wooden bench along the wall and waited. The other customer was a woman. She was perhaps 24 or 25, though it was difficult to be certain, with dark brown hair that she wore pinned up under a practical hat of the sort women wore when they were traveling or working, rather than trying to make an impression. Her dress was good quality but showed the dust of considerable travel, and she stood at the counter with the posture of someone accustomed to being taken seriously, who has recently encountered evidence that she might not be. She had a folder of papers in one hand, and she was speaking to Peters in a tone that was controlled and firm, and only slightly frayed at the edges with frustration. "I have the deed here and I have the proof of claim," she said, spreading the papers on the counter with a precision that suggested she had done this before, perhaps several times. "The land was homesteaded by my father, Robert Walker, in 1869. He passed away in February of this year. I am his heir, and I have the legal documentation to prove it. What I need from you is confirmation that the title has been properly transferred into my name." Peters was peering at the papers with his spectacles still on his forehead, which meant he was not actually reading them so much as looking at them. The way a man looks at something he has already decided is not his problem. "The difficulty, Miss Walker," he said, "is that this office does not typically process inheritance claims of this nature without the signature of a male executor or co-signatory. It's simply the established procedure." "The established procedure," the woman said, and her voice had gone to a quality that reminded Henry, sitting across the room on his bench, of the particular stillness before a prairie storm, "is set down in the Homestead Act and in the statutes of the state of Kansas, and neither of those documents requires the signature of a male anything. My father had no male executor. I am his sole heir and the deed passes to me. I would be grateful if you would process the transfer." Peters looked like a man who wanted to find a different problem to solve. His eyes drifted around the room and landed briefly on Henry, possibly in search of an ally, and Henry looked away with the deliberate neutrality of someone who has learned not to involve himself in other people's difficulties. Then he looked back, because something about the way the woman was standing straight-backed and steady in the face of a bureaucracy that was doing its level best to wear her down struck him as worthy of attention. "Is the deed in order?" Henry said. Both the woman and Peters looked at him. Peters appeared surprised that Henry had spoken. The woman appeared to be reserving judgment. "I beg your pardon," Peters said. "The deed and the documentation she brought," Henry said, rising from the bench and moving to the counter because sitting down while involving himself in something felt inappropriate in a way he could not have articulated. "Is there an actual legal problem with them, or is it a matter of preference?" Peters drew himself up slightly. "I'm not certain this is, because if there's no actual legal deficiency in the documents," Henry continued, in the same unhurried tone he used when talking to nervous horses, "then preference isn't really a professional consideration, is it?" There was a silence. Peters looked at the papers. The woman looked at Henry with an expression that was measuring and guarded, and something else underneath that he could not immediately read. Peters processed the transfer. Outside on the wooden sidewalk, in the spring sunshine with the dust of Caldwell's Main Street moving gently in the wind, the woman stopped and turned to face him. Up close she had gray eyes, the clear steady gray of a November sky before snow, and there was an intelligence in them that was immediately apparent and not particularly soft. "Thank you," she said. That was unnecessary, but I appreciate it. It was unnecessary, Henry agreed, because you were right and you would have gotten there eventually. But sometimes things move faster when someone confirms what's already true. She studied him for a moment. You have land near here, 320 acres south of the creek, about 20 miles out. I've been traveling for 2 days, she said, and for just a moment the controlled steadiness in her face shifted to reveal something tired beneath it. My father's land is about 15 miles northeast of town. I haven't seen it since I was a child. Walker, Henry said. I know the name. Your father's spread borders the Dunbar property on the east side. She looked at him with a sharpened interest. You knew him? No, but I know the land in this county reasonably well by now. I've been here since last fall. He paused. I'm Henry Whitaker. Harriet Walker, she said, and offered her hand the way a woman offers her hand when she is fully aware it is slightly unusual for the context and has decided not to care. He shook it. Her grip was firm. Are you traveling alone? He asked, and then immediately felt the question was none of his business and added, I'm asking because the road northeast has a stretch that's been poorly marked since the spring floods moved some of the markers. If you're not familiar with the area, it's easy to drift east toward the Cimarron. She watched him decide to explain himself, and something in her face eased almost imperceptibly. I have a wagon and a hired man from town, but I'd be grateful for directions. He gave them to her, pulling a piece of paper from his coat pocket and drawing a rough map with a stub of pencil, marking the fork where the road was confusing and the dry creek bed that looked like a road but wasn't. She folded it with the same precise economy with which she had spread her legal documents on the counter and put it in her bag. Thank you again, she said. Mr. Whitaker. Miss Walker, he said. She walked away down the sidewalk toward the livery, and Henry stood in the spring sunshine and watched the dust settle behind her, and then he went back into the land office to argue about his water rights. It was 3 weeks before he saw her again. Those 3 weeks were full of the work that land required in spring. The breaking of ground for a kitchen garden. The continuing work of the house he was building from lumber hauled in from Caldwell. The digging of a proper well to supplement the creek. The constant negotiation with the soil about what it was willing to do and what it absolutely was not. Henry had contracted with a neighbor, a Bohemian farmer named Novak who had been on his land for 2 years already, and whose fields were producing in ways that made Henry watch him carefully and ask questions whenever the opportunity arose. Novak was a quiet man with enormous hands and a philosophical temperament that seemed to have been arrived at through practical rather than intellectual means, and he was generous with what he knew. Wheat is what this ground wants, Novak told him one evening, sitting on the step of Henry's half-built house with his pipe going. Winter wheat. You plant in autumn, you harvest in summer. The ground here does not forget winter. You must work with what it remembers. I was thinking corn, Henry said. Novak shook his head with the patient certainty of a man who has already made all the mistakes. Corn is what you want. Wheat is what the ground wants. The ground is here longer than you. Henry thought about this. I'll plant wheat, he said. Novak nodded and knocked out his pipe on the step. Also, he said, with the particular careful neutrality of a man mentioning something that is not his business but that he has decided to mention anyway, you should get a dog. This land is too quiet for one man. Henry did not get a dog, but he thought about it. He was riding the fence line along his northern boundary on a Thursday afternoon in mid-May when he saw the Walker property for the first time up close. He had not been riding with any intention of going that direction, but the fence needed checking and the fence ran north, and after a while he became aware that he was within sight of the small house that sat on a low rise about a mile inside the property line of the Walker claim. He pulled up and looked at it for a moment. It was a modest structure, in reasonable repair from a distance, with a garden plot behind it and what appeared to be an attempt at breaking soil for a field of some size extending to the east. And there was Harriet Walker, driving a plow team. He watched for a moment before he fully processed what he was seeing. She had 2 horses hitched to a walking plow, and she was working the team herself, which required a combination of physical strength and technical skill that he would not have automatically expected, but which she was demonstrating with a kind of grim, focused competence that suggested this was not the first time she had done it, and also that it was not easy. The hired man he had assumed she had was nowhere visible, which might mean he was somewhere else on the property, or might mean she had parted ways with him. And either way, she was plowing a field alone in May and making reasonable progress. He sat on Sargent and watched for longer than was entirely polite, and then she looked up, probably because the horses registered Sargent's presence before she did, and they looked at each other across about 200 yards of spring grass. After a moment he raised his hat. After a moment she raised one hand briefly, then returned it to the plow handles. He rode on. But he thought about it that evening, and the evening after, and he found the thoughts persisting in ways that were slightly inconvenient. She was a woman alone on 320 acres, apparently, or nearly alone, driving a plow team in May with the focus of someone who does not have the luxury of stopping. He knew what that was like, the relentlessness of land in spring, the feeling that every day you are not working is a day the land is winning. He also knew something about doing it with no one to share it with, and that particular knowledge was less comfortable than all the others. He decided to ride over and offer to help with the plowing. He was a neighbor. That was what neighbors did. It was practical and had nothing to do with gray eyes or the particular quality of someone's posture when they were refusing to be diminished by a bureaucrat in a land office. He told himself this firmly and then rode over the next morning. She was in the kitchen garden when he arrived, which was enclosed by a fence of vertical stakes that she had clearly driven herself, and she looked up when he came through the gate she had left open and said, "Mr. Whitaker," with the tone of someone who is neither surprised nor displeased, but is maintaining the option to be either. "Miss Walker," he said, dismounting and looping Sargent's reins around the fence post. "I came to offer a hand with your field work. I'm between jobs on my own place for a few days." This was not entirely true. There was always something to do, but it was close enough to true that it did not feel like a lie. She looked at him steadily. The gray eyes did their measuring thing. "I don't have much to offer in return," she said. "I can feed you lunch." "I'm not asking for anything in return," he said. There was a brief silence while she apparently decided whether to accept this or argue with it. Then she handed him the trowel she had been using and said, "All right, but I show you how I want things done. I have a particular way of working." "I suspected you might," he said. The corner of her mouth moved. She did have a particular way of working, systematic, thorough, with an attention to detail that he found himself respecting even when it was more precise than he would have been inclined to be on his own. She had laid out the field she wanted to break in a grid pattern, marking rows with stakes and string so the furrows would be straight, and she had a plan for drainage that she explained to him while they walked the ground, pointing with a practical hand at features of the terrain that he recognized she had taken genuine time to study. "You've done this before," he said, when she had finished explaining. "My father's farm was in Ohio," she said. "I grew up working it. When he moved west, I was already teaching school in Cleveland, so I didn't come with him." She paused. "I regret that now." He did not ask about the regret. Some things you recognized as not requiring a follow-up question. They worked through the morning, he on the plow team and she on the secondary breaking work, and by noon they had broken twice what she had managed in the previous 2 days alone. She had told him the truth about lunch. It was simple food, biscuits and salt pork and dried apple, eaten at the rough table inside the small house. But she made coffee strong enough to mean something, and she set the table properly, which, Henry thought, was a choice that spoke to something in her character he did not yet have a name for. A person who sets the table properly when she has almost nothing is a person who believes in the meaning of ordinary things. "Do you have anyone coming to help you?" he asked. "Family or no family," she said. "I have a letter into the extension office about a hired hand for the summer. I'm hoping something comes of it." "What happened to the man who came with you from town?" She looked at her coffee cup. "He decided Kansas wasn't for him, which he communicated by leaving before sunrise on my third morning here." Her voice was even and factual, and he could tell the betrayal of it had cost her something she was not going to show. "I'm sorry," he said. "Don't be," she said. "It's clarifying. I know where I stand." She looked up. "I know what this land requires, and I know what I'm capable of. Those are the two things that matter." "There's a third thing," he said. "What's that?" "Whether you want to stay." She looked at him for a moment. "I do," she said. "I want to stay. I want to make this work. I want to." She stopped, and he watched her decide how much to give away, and then she said, "I want to make something out of what my father started here. He spent 4 years alone on this land. He died in February in a bed he made himself in a room that had a view of fields he had broken and a sky that was very large, and the letter he sent me in January, the last one, he said the land was good, that he had made something. I want to see that finished." Henry sat with that for a moment. Outside the window, the broken field lay dark and waiting in the May sunshine, and the grass beyond it was the particular green of early Kansas spring, and the sky was doing its enormous thing. "Your father was right," he said. "The land is good. I've been talking to Novak, he's Bohemian, 2 miles west of my place, and he says this whole stretch of country is good for winter wheat. The soil structure holds moisture in a way some of the land further north doesn't." She looked at him with an expression that was almost relief. "My father mentioned wheat in his letters. You'll want to get the field broken by August at the latest if you're planting winter wheat this fall," he said. "That gives it time to settle before seeding." She nodded slowly. Something in her posture changed just slightly, and he thought it was the shift a person makes when they've been carrying something alone and someone has reached out and touched the edge of the weight, not taken it, just acknowledged it was there. "I can spare time 2 or 3 days a week for the next month," he said, "to help with the field breaking. My own field work is mostly done until summer." Again, not entirely true, but close enough. She looked at him for a long moment. "Why?" she said. It was a direct question, and he owed it a direct answer. He thought about it. "Because you're a neighbor," he said, "and the work is better with 2 people." He paused. "And because you're clearly going to do it one way or another, and watching someone work that hard alone when there's no need for it bothers me more than the extra time will." Something behind her eyes shifted. Not quite a smile, but the thing that comes before a smile, in someone who is careful about where they let their feelings show. "All right," she said, 2 or 3 days a week. I can offer lunch and dinner on days you stay late." "That's more than fair," he said. He rode home that evening in the long Kansas twilight with the smell of broken earth on his clothes, and the sound of her voice somewhere in his mind, talking about soil drainage in her father's fields in Ohio. And somewhere around the point where the creek crossed his property line, he became aware of something in his chest that felt different from the emptiness he had been carrying for the better part of 17 years. He did not examine it. He was a man who had learned not to examine things too closely. But he noticed it, the way you notice a change in the weather before you can say exactly what has changed. He came back 3 days later, and then 2 days after that, and the rhythm of it established itself almost without discussion. The working mornings, the lunch at the rough table, the conversations that grew longer as the days grew longer, and the work grew easier because 2 people learned to work together the way water learns the shape of a riverbed. He learned things about her in layers, the way you learn a piece of country by crossing it in different weathers. She had been a school teacher for 3 years in Cleveland, which explained the precision of her thinking and the directness of her speech, and the tendency she had of pausing before she answered a question, as if she was considering not just the answer but whether it was the most accurate answer. She could read Latin, which she had learned from a minister's wife who had taken an interest in her education, and she read everything she could find, which in this part of Kansas meant mail-order books and the newspapers that came into Caldwell by train, and the occasional volume found at the dry goods store. She had opinions about nearly everything, and she expressed them without apology, which Henry found more interesting than he had expected. He was used to being the person in any conversation with the views, largely because he was often the only person in the conversation, and finding someone who pushed back and argued and changed his mind about things was a new experience that he was discovering he liked considerably. She learned things about him too, though he gave less willingly and she did not press. She learned that he had grown up in Missouri, that he had driven cattle, that he had a precise and practical knowledge of horses, and a theoretical but growing knowledge of farming. She learned that he could fix almost anything mechanical if given enough time and the right tools, that he had read everything he could find as well, that he had opinions about things but that he often held them quietly until he had thought about them long enough to be sure. One evening in late May, when they had been working particularly well together and the light had gone gold and long over the broken field, she brought coffee out to the edge of the turned earth and they stood looking at what they had made, which was a good portion of 50 acres of dark turned ground, and she said, "It's starting to look like something." "It will look like something different in October," he said, "when the wheat's up." "I keep trying to picture it," she said, "green coming up in rows. My father wrote about the mornings in fall when you could see the first shoots and it looked like—" She stopped and smiled, and the smile was something he was getting used to and still found slightly startling. He said it looked like hope written in green ink. Henry was quiet for a moment. He thought about the deed in his breast pocket, worn soft at the creases from being folded and unfolded too many times. He thought about riding onto his land for the first time and feeling the largeness of it and the emptiness and the way neither of those things had resolved into what he had expected. He thought about how the work on her land, 3 days a week, had started to feel like something his own land did not like purpose with a person attached to it, like something that was going somewhere. "Your father was a poet," he said. "He was a farmer," she said. "But he paid attention." She looked at him sideways. "You pay attention too." "It's a useful habit," he said, and she laughed, a real laugh, not a polite one, the first full laugh he had heard from her, and it was warm and sudden and entirely unlike the controlled evenness of her usual expression, and something in Henry Whitaker's chest did a thing that he was going to have to stop pretending was not happening. June came in hot and clear, the kind of Kansas summer that was either a blessing or a punishment depending on whether your crops had water, and Henry made sure they had water. He had spent considerable effort through the spring, digging an extended irrigation channel from the creek that ran through his property to the northern boundary, and he had discussed with Harriet the possibility of extending a secondary channel from the small spring on the northwest corner of her property to serve the wheat field when it went in. It was a project that would require several days of work and materials, and he brought Novik over to look at it because Novik had done something similar on his own land 2 years earlier. Novik stood at the edge of the proposed channel route with his pipe and looked at the terrain with the careful attention of a man who has learned to read ground the way other men read books. Then he looked at Harriet, who was standing beside Henry, and had been asking Novik practical questions about gradient and flow rate with the focused intelligence that Henry by now associated entirely with her. "She knows what she is doing," Novik said to Henry in the tone of a man making an observation that is also a compliment. "She does," Henry agreed. "The channel will work," Novik said. "You will need to line the first section with stone to prevent collapse. I have stones." He looked at Harriet. "I will bring them. My wife also wants to meet you. She has been asking about the Walker place since February." Harriet's expression warmed in a way Henry had not seen directed at anyone other than himself. "I would be very glad to meet her," she said. So the Noviks came, Ivan and his wife Marta, a broad and energetic woman who spoke rapid English interspersed with Czech, and who brought a covered dish and an opinion about everything with equal enthusiasm. And the 4 of them worked on the channel for 2 days and ate together in the evenings, and Henry watched Harriet with the Noviks and felt something complicated that was partly gratitude and partly something else, something that had to do with the way she looked when she was not alone. when there were other people around her, and she expanded into the space of it, became warmer and more vivid, laughed more, talked with her hands when she was excited about something. He was in love with her. He had been trying not to use that word, but sitting across the table from her on the second evening with the lamplight doing things to the color of her hair and her laughing at something Marta had said about chickens, he admitted it to himself with the thoroughness of a man who has been avoiding a conclusion that was always going to be unavoidable. The question was what to do about it. The question sat with him through the rest of June, while the field work continued and the house he was building took shape, and the channel they had dug began to do what channels were supposed to do. And while he and Harriet worked side by side 3 days a week and ate lunch together and talked about everything except the thing he was thinking about. She was always glad to see him. He was reasonably sure of that. And there was a quality to their time together that was different from easy work-neighbor friendship, a kind of charged attentiveness they both maintained, as if each was very aware of the exact location of the other at all times, which Henry recognized as a symptom of something. He was also aware that she had come to this land with a purpose and a weight of grief and a determination to prove something, to herself, to the memory of her father, possibly to everyone who had ever assumed that a woman alone on 320 acres of Kansas grassland was not going to last, and that any complication he introduced into her life had to be one she wanted, not one she merely tolerated out of gratitude or practical necessity. He would rather ride 20 miles in the opposite direction than let gratitude be the thing that brought her to him. So he kept his own counsel and worked, and watched the summer come on in full force. It was a dispute with Doster that changed things. Gideon Doster was Henry's neighbor to the north, a heavy-set man in his late 40s who had the manner of someone accustomed to operating on the assumption that what he wanted and what was fair were the same thing. He had been claiming the creek as his water source for 2 years, despite the fact that Henry's land survey clearly showed the creek's main channel running through Henry's property, and Henry had been dealing with this through the land office, and through the patient obstinacy that was one of his more reliable tools. What he had not anticipated was that Doster would expand his campaign to include the Walker property. He found out on a Wednesday morning in early July when he arrived at Harriet's place and found her standing in her yard with a document in her hand and the expression of someone who is very angry and is managing it well. "Doster sent a man," she said, holding out the document. "He's claiming the spring on the northwest corner of my property is part of a watershed that feeds his land and that I cannot divert it without his permission." Henry took the document and read it. It was a letter from a lawyer in Caldwell, citing a series of water rights claims that were, as far as Henry could tell, entirely fabricated or at minimum grossly overstated. He read it twice. Then he folded it and handed it back to her. "This is what he tried with me last fall," he said. "Same lawyer, same tactic. What did you do?" "Went to the land office, filed a counterclaim, and waited him out. He doesn't have a legal basis. He's hoping you'll either believe him or be intimidated enough to give up the point." She looked at the letter with an expression that was clear and direct. "He has misjudged the situation," she said. Henry felt something bright and entirely involuntary move through him. "He has," he agreed. "I'll ride into Caldwell tomorrow," she said. "Will you come? You know the land office process better than I do at this point." "I'll come," he said. They rode into Caldwell together the following morning on a day that was bright and hot, and the ride took the better part of 2 hours, and somewhere in the middle of it, with the grass moving in the wind on either side of the track and the sky doing its enormous blue thing above, Harriet said, "Can I ask you something personal?" He looked at her. "You can ask." "Why did you come back?" she said. "After that first morning. You offered to help and I accepted, and that was neighborly, but then you kept coming back. You've given me more hours of work this spring than any hired man would have." He considered the question for a full minute. The horses moved steadily. A meadowlark called somewhere in the grass. Because I wanted to, he said finally. Because the work is better there than at my own place. Because he stopped and looked at the horizon and made a decision. Because being near you is better than not being near you. That's the honest answer. She was quiet for a moment. When he looked at her, she was looking forward at the road, with a particular stillness on her face that he had learned to recognize as the sign that she was thinking something through completely before she responded. "I've been thinking the same thing," she said. "Since the morning you showed up and drove my plow team." She paused. "It's inconvenient." "Very," he agreed. "I came here to build something," she said. I didn't come here looking for I know," he said. "Neither did I, but it's there," she said. "It's there," he agreed. They rode for another while in a silence that was entirely different from any silence they had ridden in before, warmer and less restrained, with the quality of a door that had been standing closed for a long time and was now open. In Caldwell, they went to the land office and filed the counterclaim, and Peters, who had apparently been sufficiently embarrassed by the first encounter to treat Harriet with something closer to the proper professional respect this time, walked them through the process with reasonable efficiency. Then they went to the general store for supplies, and Henry carried her bags to the wagon, and she thanked him, and they stood in the street in the July heat looking at each other. "Come for dinner on Sunday," she said. "All right," he said. "Not to work," she said, "just to come." Something in him settled that had been uncertain for a long time. "I'll be there," he said. He was there on Sunday. She had cooked a proper meal, roast chicken that she had somehow sourced, biscuits that were better than anything he made, a dish of early greens from the kitchen garden, pie made from dried cherries that had come on the supply wagon. She had set the table with care, with the tablecloth that had been her father's, a white linen thing with a small embroidered edge that looked entirely incongruous and entirely right in the small house on the Kansas plains. They ate slowly and talked about everything, and after dinner she made coffee and they sat on the step of the house in the evening air, which was still warm but bearable, and the sky went its usual spectacular colors as the sun dropped west, and they sat close enough that their arms touched along their length without either of them moving away from it. "Tell me something," she said, "that you've never told anyone." He thought about it. He watched the sky change. "My first winter on this land," he said, "there were 3 weeks in January when I didn't speak to another person. Not once, not a single word. And I started talking to Sergeant just to hear a voice." He paused. "And one night I sat outside in the cold and looked at the deed and tried to feel something about it, something besides empty." He stopped. "I had worked my whole life for that land, and I sat looking at it and I felt nothing, just the cold and the quiet and 320 acres of dark." She was very still beside him. "And now," she said. He looked at her. The evening light was doing something to her face that he was going to remember for the rest of his life. "And now when I ride onto my land, I think about the direction it faces and whether the creek is running right and how the channel will work when the wheat comes up and whether you need anything, and it's connected to something. It has a direction." He stopped because he was saying more than he had intended to and less than he meant. "You made it mean something," he said, "before there was anything to show for it." She looked at him for a long moment. The evening settled around them. From somewhere across the grass a cricket started up. "Henry," she said. "Yes," he said. "I'm going to stay here," she said. "Whatever happens, I'm going to stay on this land and build what my father started and plant that wheat in September and harvest it next summer. That is not going to change." "I know," he said. "And I think I am falling in love with you," she said, with the same directness she brought to everything, the clarity that was one of the most extraordinary things about her. "And I think you should know that." He turned to face her fully. "I am entirely in love with you," he said. "That is less, I think, and more, I am certain. I've been certain for some time." She looked at him with the gray eyes that were darker in the evening light, and then she smiled, the full, warm, real smile that was still slightly startling every time he saw it, and something in Henry Whitaker's chest that had been braced against emptiness for 17 years let go of itself. He kissed her the way a man kisses a woman he has been careful about, with thoroughness and intention and no particular urgency, because there was no need for urgency. They were not going anywhere. They were both exactly where they were supposed to be. She kissed him back with the same quality, which told him something true and important about her that he stored alongside everything else he knew about her like something precious. The summer deepened, and everything changed in ways that were subtle at first and then unmistakable. He was still at his own place, working his own land, and she was at hers, and they maintained the practical arrangements of neighboring landowners who are also building a friendship and also something more than friendship. But the quality of the days shifted. He rode over more often, and she rode over to his place sometimes, early in the morning when the light was new and the air had not yet gotten hot, and she would look at what he had built and ask questions about it with the intelligence she brought to everything. And he would look at her looking at his land and feel it settle into itself the way a thing settles when it's been seen properly. Marta Novick came one afternoon in August, ostensibly to return a pie plate, and found Henry building a new fence section on the west side of Harriet's kitchen garden, while Harriet planted a late crop of turnips inside it, and Marta stood watching them for a moment with the expression of a woman who has correctly identified a situation. And then she said, loudly, "So," and they both looked up. Marta went home and reported to Ivan that things were progressing as they should, which Ivan received with the philosophical nod of a man who had expected as much. August was full and busy and hot. Doster, having been effectively rebuffed through the legal process by both Henry and Harriet filing counterclaims that referenced each other's survey documents, retreated into a sullen non-engagement that was considerably easier to manage than active harassment. The wheat seed came in on the August supply wagon. Henry had ordered it through Novick, who had a contact in Hutchinson that got good prices, and Harriet spent 3 evenings sorting and checking it with the focused attention she gave everything. And Henry sat on her step in the August evenings watching her work in the lamplight that came through the open door, and thought that he had never in his life looked forward to anything the way he looked forward to Tuesday and Thursday and Saturday mornings when he rode northeast. It was on a Saturday evening in late August that Henry Whitaker did the thing he had been thinking about since June, and which, once he started thinking about it in practical terms, had taken on the quality of inevitability that certain things have when they are right. He had brought a bottle of decent whiskey from Caldwell, which he had purchased from the saloon supply at considerable expense for a single bottle, and they sat on her step in the warm dusk and had a glass each and watched the stars come out over the Kansas grass, and he said, "I'd like to ask you something." She turned to look at him. She had learned to read the particular quality of his silences, and this one was different. "I'd like to marry you," he said. "Not because it's practical, though it is, and not because it would solve any particular problem, though there are things it would make simpler, but because I have spent my entire adult life building towards something, and the only time it has ever felt like it meant anything was this spring and summer, working alongside you. And I would like the rest of my life to continue being the way this summer has been." He paused. "You said you were staying. I'd like to stay with you." She looked at him for a long time. The stars were coming out in the enormous Kansas sky, and the grass moved in the warm evening wind, and somewhere in the dark a night bird called once and then was quiet. "What would that look like?" she said. "Practically." He had thought about this. 2 properties run together. The channel already connects them through the Novick boundary. We plant both fields in wheat this fall. Your house as the main house, it's more settled, has more land under cultivation already. I finish my house to a standard that makes it worth keeping for storage or for help we hire. We work both properties as one operation. She was looking at him with the measuring look that he had stopped finding daunting and started finding endearing, because what followed it was always something honest. "And what do I give up?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "Your deed stays in your name. Your land stays your land. I'm not asking you to give it up or fold it into mine. I'm asking to fold mine into yours if you want it that way." The measuring look held for another moment. Then it changed to something else, warmer and less guarded, and she said, "That is not the way most men would arrange it." "I'm not most men," he said, "and you're not a woman who would be well served by most arrangements." She was quiet for a breath. Then she said, "Yes." He said, "Yes. Yes," she said. "I'll marry you, Henry Whitaker. I would be glad to marry you." He kissed her and she kissed him back in the warm August dark, and the stars came out fully overhead, and the grass went on its usual way, and the land that had felt like nothing for so long was full of something that neither of them had a precise word for, but that was entirely sufficient without one. They were married in September, in the Caldwell Church and Schoolhouse on a Thursday when it was between uses for both purposes, with Reverend Aldridge officiating, and the Noviks as witnesses, and Marta crying with the enthusiastic abandon of a woman who has been expecting and wanting this outcome, and is deeply satisfied by its arrival. Peters from the land office came because he had apparently developed a retroactive admiration for Harriet after the water rights business, and wanted to acknowledge it somehow. And a few other neighbors from the surrounding miles came, because word had gotten around in the way word gets around in thinly populated country. Harriet wore a dress she had made from fabric ordered from Caldwell's general store, a deep blue that was not wedding white but suited her considerably better, and her hair was dressed with careful attention, and she carried a handful of late wildflowers that Marta had contributed from her kitchen garden. Henry wore his good coat and a necktie he had not worn since before he could clearly remember, and they stood before Reverend Aldridge and said the words with the seriousness they both brought to things that mattered. And when he put the ring on her finger, a simple gold band that had cost him the better part of 2 weeks' wages, and that he had ordered from the jewelry case in the general store, which had 3 rings and only one in the right size, which he chose to take as a sign. She looked at it with an expression that was private and full and entirely beautiful. The reception, such as it was, happened at the Novik place because Marta had been planning it since August, and no one was going to tell Marta she could not plan it. There was food in quantities that were genuinely impressive for the time and place, and there was music from a fiddle that Ivan Novik turned out to play with unexpected passion, and there was dancing on the flat ground outside the Novik house in the September evening, and Henry danced with Harriet somewhat better than he had expected to, and she danced well, with the rhythm and grace she brought to physical work generally. And they laughed at each other, and then not at each other, and Marta said later to Ivan that she had not seen a man look at a woman that way since the day Ivan had looked at her, which Ivan received with the philosophical nod, and the additional observation that the whiskey was also very good. They went home to Harriet's house that night, their house now, and the September sky was enormous and full of stars, and the broken field lay dark and ready in the starlight. And somewhere in the southwest corner, the first of the wheat seed had gone into the ground that afternoon with Henry's hands and Harriet's, working the rows together in the golden September light before they rode into Caldwell. Henry stood outside for a moment before going in, looking at the field and the sky and the long dark line of his own land to the southwest, and Harriet came and stood beside him, and he put his arm around her, and she leaned against him, and they looked at it together. "It's going to come up beautifully," she said. "It is," he said. "My father would have liked you," she said. He thought about Robert Walker, who had spent 4 years alone on this land and had written his daughter a letter saying the land was good. "I think I would have liked him," he said. She took his hand and they went inside. October came and the wheat went into the ground in earnest, both properties now working together as one operation, with Henry managing the physical labor of the larger acreage, and Harriet managing the record-keeping and planning and the kitchen garden and the livestock. They were beginning to accumulate 2 milk cows, a small flock of chickens, a pig that arrived via trade with a neighbor to the east named Burgess who bred them, and was happy to part with one for a reasonable arrangement. Novik came over twice a week, and they worked alongside each other with the easy efficiency of people who have learned to read each other's work rhythms. And Marta came with him sometimes, and she and Harriet would go over the house, or the garden, or the supply situation with the same thorough attention that Henry and Ivan gave the fields. The autumn was warm and dry enough to be ideal for seeding, and then received exactly the right amount of rain in November to send the young wheat down roots it would rely on through the winter. Henry, who had by this point read everything Novak could find in English and Czech about winter wheat cultivation in the Kansas climate, walked the fields in November examining the condition of the young seedlings, with an attention to detail that would have surprised the ranchers and trail bosses of his earlier life, who had known him primarily as a man who was reliable and quiet and very good with horses. Harriet walked with him some evenings when the light lasted, and they would move between the rows slowly, and she would ask questions that sharpened his thinking, and he would answer and sometimes reverse himself when she pointed out something he had missed, and the land felt under their feet like something that was waiting for what came next. The first real snow came in December, and with it came the particular quality of a Kansas winter that Henry had experienced once before and had not entirely been prepared for the first time the absolute severity of it. The wind that came off the open plain with nothing to stop it for hundreds of miles. The temperatures that dropped fast and stayed low and made every trip outside a considered decision. They had prepared as well as they could. The livestock were in a shelter they had built in September. There were supplies enough for 3 months stacked in the root cellar. The house had new insulation in the walls that Henry had put in during October, and there was firewood cut and stacked to a height that Harriet had determined was necessary, and which had initially seemed excessive to Henry until he saw how fast a Kansas winter consumed it. They were, essentially, alone together for the first time for extended periods, and the discovery they made was that this was extremely easy. They talked. They read, sometimes aloud to each other in the evenings by the fire. Henry had 2 volumes of history and a collected edition of poems by Longfellow that had been in his saddlebag since Abilene, and Harriet had 4 novels and a book on agricultural science that she had ordered before leaving Cleveland. They played cards. They had long conversations that started on one subject and arrived, through a series of turns that were interesting in themselves, on entirely different subjects. And Henry discovered that the pleasure of talking to an intelligent person who argued back and changed her mind when the argument was good, and made him change his mind when hers was better, was something he had been missing without knowing he was missing it. He was also deeply aware, in those winter months, that he was sharing a life with her in the small practical ways that constitute the actual texture of daily existence. That she made coffee at the same time every morning, and handed him a cup before he had finished putting on his boots. That she had a particular way of reading where she held the book very close and moved her lips slightly on words that interested her. That she was organized in the kitchen to a degree that made him conscious of his own tendency toward approximate arrangement of things. That she slept deeply and quietly, and did not seem to mind that he sometimes woke early and lay listening to the wind for a while before going back to sleep. It was in January, a cold, clear Sunday afternoon with snow on the ground and nothing requiring immediate attention, that she told him she thought she might be expecting. He was sitting at the table with the agricultural science book, which she had lent him in November and which he had been reading with considerable interest, and she said it from across the room in the same tone she used for practical observations, though there was something in her voice that was not quite as steady as usual. He put the book down and looked at her. "Are you sure?" "Not completely," she said. "Not yet, but I think so." He sat with this for a moment. The fire was burning well. Outside the windows the snow lay brilliant and still in the winter light. "How do you feel about it?" he said. She looked at him. The gray eyes were full of something complex. "Scared," she said, "and glad." She paused, "Both very much." He got up and crossed the room and took her hands in his and stood looking at her. "Both of those seem exactly right," he said. "There's no doctor closer than Caldwell," she said, "and in winter Marta," he said. Marta has delivered half the babies in this county, according to Ivan. You talked to Ivan about this. Not about this specifically. He mentioned it once generally. She looked at him with an expression that was partly exasperated and partly touched. We should tell them, she said. When you're certain, he said. When I'm certain, she agreed. By February she was certain, and Marta received the news with a level of enthusiasm that was not entirely surprising given Marta's general approach to good news, and began making plans and bringing things over small garments she had been making against hope. A carved wooden cradle that Ivan had made for their own children years ago, and which he polished and brought over without comment. A collection of practical wisdom that Marta delivered in sessions that were partly advisory and partly simply good company. The wheat spent February and March under a covering of snow and ice that looked, to Henry's occasional anxiety, like it might be too severe. But Novik told him this was normal and in some ways beneficial. The snow insulated the ground, protected the seedlings, held moisture that would serve them in spring, and Henry trusted Novik because Novik had been right about everything so far. Spring came back. The snow melted and the creek ran high and cold, and the broken fields emerged from winter looking battered but intact. And within 2 weeks of the thaw, the first green showed in the wheat rows, tentative and then unmistakable, the young shoots pushing through the dark Kansas earth in the long pale rows they had planted in the fall. Henry saw it on a morning in late March, riding the field line at first light, and he stopped Sargent and sat looking at it for a long time, the green coming up in rows across the dark ground, reaching toward a sky that was the clear pale blue of early spring, and the creek running on the western edge, and the house on the rise behind him with smoke coming from the chimney, and inside the house Harriet, who was in her 7th month and who had made coffee and was probably wondering where he had gone. He thought about the deed, worn soft at the creases in his breast pocket. He reached in and took it out and unfolded it and looked at the words, 320 acres in the county of Sumner in the state of Kansas, being the property of Henry Whitaker. And then he looked at the green wheat coming up in the morning light and the house on the rise and thought about how entirely wrong he had been about what the land was for. He had thought it was an end point. He had been arriving. But it turned out to be a beginning, which required a very different kind of person than he had been when he rode onto it for the first time in the spring of 1874. He folded the deed and put it back in his pocket and rode to the house. She was at the table with her coffee and the agricultural science book, which she had taken back in February, and she looked up when he came in. "The wheat is up," he said. Her face did the thing it did when she was glad, not the sudden full smile but the slower thing that started in her eyes. "All of it. Both fields," he said. "All the way to the eastern boundary." She set down the book and he helped her up. She was in her 7th month and the balance was different now. And they went out onto the step together into the March morning air and looked out across the distance at where the green rows were just visible, too far to see clearly but present in the landscape, the way new things are present, quietly and definitely. "Your father was right," she said. "It does look like hope written in green ink." "It does," he said. She leaned back against him and he put his arms around her carefully, and they stood in the March morning looking at the wheat fields of 2 properties that had become one, and the sky was the enormous Kansas sky, and everything that had been empty was full. Their son was born in May. Marta was there, and she was exactly as competent as Ivan had suggested, and the labor was long but concluded safely. And when it was done and Henry was allowed back into the room, he sat on the edge of the bed, and Harriet put the baby in his arms and looked at his face while he looked at the baby. And what she saw there was something she kept private in the way she kept her most important things, as something entirely her own. They named him Robert for her father, which Henry had suggested and which had made her cry for the first and only time in his presence, a few quiet tears that she did not try to hide. The spring of 1875 was the best thing Henry Whitaker had ever seen. The wheat grew through April and May with the steady patience of something that has been waiting and is now fully ready. And by June it stood knee-high and golden green in the long rows. And by July it was heading out in the thick full ears that Novik walked through, shaking his head with a satisfaction he expressed through silence, because some things were too good to talk about. Harriet walked the fields with Robert on her hip in the July evenings when the light was long and the wheat moved in the warm wind like something breathing. And Henry walked with her. And little Robert, who was 2 months old and had his mother's gray eyes and his father's particular quality of attention, looked at the moving wheat with an expression of grave interest that made both his parents laugh. "He's deciding what he thinks about it," Harriet said. "He's got your way of thinking things through before he commits," Henry said. She looked at him sideways with the look that was partly exasperated and mostly fond. "I hope he has your patience," she said. "Mine runs out faster." "Your patience runs out," Henry agreed. "But then you do the thing twice as efficiently as most people would have with infinite patience, so it balances." She laughed. Robert looked alarmed by the laugh and then settled back to his grave contemplation of the wheat. The harvest came in August, with heat and the sweet smell of ripe grain and the rattling work of cutting and thrashing that took 2 weeks, and the help of the Noviks and 2 men Henry had hired from town for the season. Harriet managed the household and the supply of food to the workers and the record-keeping with a precision that kept everything moving without apparent effort. And on the last day of harvest, she stood at the edge of the cleared field with Robert on her hip and Henry beside her, and they looked at the stubble and the stacked sheaves and the numbers in the ledger she held in her free hand. "It's a good yield," she said. "It's an excellent yield," Henry said. He had checked with Novik and with the grain buyer in Caldwell, and the number was better than either of them had projected. "Enough to expand next year," she said. "The eastern acreage on your property is good ground." "If we break it in September, Harriet," he said. She looked at him. "Can we stand here for one moment," he said, "and not plan the next thing?" She looked at the field. She looked at Robert, who had a fist full of her hair and was not particularly troubled by any of the large questions of farming economics. She looked at Henry. "All right," she said. "One moment." They stood in the August heat with the harvest smell in the air and the big sky overhead, and the sound of the men finishing work somewhere in the distance. And Robert made a small contented sound and closed his eyes, and the moments stretched out the way moments do when you let them, warm and full and complete. "He's asleep," Henry said. "He always sleeps after complaining about the heat," she said softly, not to wake him. Henry took her free hand in his, and she threaded her fingers through his, and they stood in the golden August afternoon in the harvest field. And it was everything he had spent his whole life building toward without knowing what he was building toward. And it was better than the deed, and better than the land, and better than anything he had thought he wanted when he was 25 and driving cattle and saving wages, and telling himself that a man with his own land had something. He had something now. Something the deed had never been able to describe. In the fall of 1875, they broke the eastern acreage and planted it in winter wheat. They also hired a permanent hand, a young man of 20 named James Collier, who had come west from Kentucky with the broad skills and limited prospects of someone who was very good at work and very short on capital, and who turned out to be excellent with livestock and steady in his habits, and who built himself a small quarters in Henry's original house, which they had converted for the purpose. James worked with the ease of someone who has found the right place, and Harriet fed him at their table and talked to him about what he was interested in and what he wanted eventually. And Henry watched this and thought that this was another thing she did. She made people feel that where they were mattered and what they were doing was worth doing. Doster, having run out of legal strategies and apparently decided the effort was not worth the return, sold his claim in late 1875 to a Mennonite family named Schroeder, who moved in during the spring of 1876 with 6 children, and a work ethic that made even Novik raise his eyebrows appreciatively. The Schroeders became good neighbors. the kind who traded labor and tools with easy generosity, and their eldest daughter, Anna, who was 17 in the spring of 1876 and 18 in the fall, became Harriet's particular friend after a conversation about book learning that apparently established mutual respect immediately. The spring of 1876 brought the second wheat crop up in both the original fields and the new eastern acreage, and the yield projection was even better than the year before. Harriet, who had been keeping meticulous records since the first planting, showed Henry the figures one evening in April with the satisfaction of someone who has proven something she always knew was true. "At this rate," she said, "we could expand to the southern acreage in 1877 and still maintain a comfortable operating reserve." "What's a comfortable operating reserve to you?" he asked. "6 months of supplies and payroll if the harvest fails entirely," she said. "Which it won't, but 6 months gives us time to sell stock and adjust without losing the land." He looked at the figures. "That's conservative." "My father lost land in Ohio," she said simply. "Once is enough for that lesson." He nodded. "South acreage in 1877 then," she smiled. "And possibly a second hired man if James's workload keeps increasing." "James's workload will keep increasing," he said. "He works like 3 people. He wants his own land eventually," she said. "I've been talking to him about the homestead process." Henry looked at her. "You're helping him file." "I know the process," she said, with a slight lift in her voice that he recognized as her version of amusement at the obvious. "And he's 21 next spring. The timing works." He reached across the ledger and took her hand, and she looked at him with the gray eyes that were the first thing he saw in the morning and the last thing he thought about before sleep. "You make everything work," he said. She turned her hand to hold his properly. "We make it work," she said. Their daughter was born in October of 1876, and they named her Clara, which was the name of Harriet's mother. And she arrived in the world with red-tinted hair that was entirely her own contribution, and a voice that Marta said was the loudest she had heard in 20 years of helping babies make their entrance, which they took as a promising sign. Robert was 16 months old when Clara arrived, and he received her with the careful gravity that was already his established mode. He looked at her for a long time, touched her hand very gently with one finger, and then apparently filed her under the category of things that were part of his world, and went back to his other business, which at 16 months consisted largely of discovering the limits of what he could climb. Henry held Clara on her first night, walking the floor slowly when she was fussy in the small hours, and thought about the trajectory of things. The deed in his pocket worn soft with handling, the empty grassland in the spring of 1874, the woman standing at a counter in the land office refusing to be diminished, the field going green in March and gold in August, the boy who had his mother's eyes, the daughter who had apparently already decided she had things to say about the world. He thought about his own father, who had drifted west and stopped writing letters, and decided that he would not waste time being sorry for the man. He thought about the years of work on other men's land, and the loneliness that had calcified into self-sufficiency, and the way loneliness masquerading as self-sufficiency could convince a man it was the same as strength. He thought about how wrong he had been about the land and what it was for, and how entirely right it had turned out to be as a place, not a destination. Clara settled and slept, and the house was quiet, and Henry stood at the window and looked out at the October night, the fields gone to winter gray and the sky brilliant with stars, and felt the particular quality of happiness that is not excitement or triumph, but simply the deep satisfaction of things being as they should be. The next morning he told Harriet he thought they should build a larger house. She put down her coffee and looked at him with the measuring look. "Where?" she said. "Between the 2 properties," he said. "On the high ground near the spring. Better view, better air, better access to both field systems." She was quiet for a moment, thinking it through the way she did. "It would take the better part of a year," she said. "We'd need a proper carpenter. Novick knows one in Hutchinson," he said, "a man named Brower who did the Schroeder's barn. And in the meantime we stay here. "It's not too small," he said. "Yet." She picked up her coffee. "Yet," she agreed. "All right, talk to Novik." The house was begun in the spring of 1877, with the carpenter Brower and his two sons doing the primary framing and Henry and James Collier doing the labor that could be done without special skill, and Harriet making decisions about the interior arrangement with the same attention to practical function that she brought to field planning. It was a proper house, 4 rooms on the ground floor, 2 up, a real porch running the south face, a kitchen that Harriet had specific requirements about, a root cellar dug properly under the pantry floor. It was, by the standards of the Kansas Plains in 1877, a substantial and well-built home. It was finished in September, and they moved in the week before the harvest began, which meant the first thing the house smelled of, after fresh lumber and plaster, was harvest dust and coffee, and the particular combination of soap and hay and wood smoke that was the smell of their daily life. Harriet stood in the kitchen on the first morning and turned around slowly looking at it, the real stove, the counter space, the window above the sink that looked south toward the fields, and Henry leaned in the doorway watching her. "Well," he said, "it's very good," she said. "The window faces exactly right. I told Brower you wanted it south-facing." She looked at him. "You told him that. You mentioned it in May," he said, "that the light from the south in the morning was what you wanted." She was quiet for a moment. "I didn't think you'd remembered that," she said. "I remember everything you say," he said. "It's possible I am an attentive listener." She came across the kitchen and took hold of his lapels and kissed him properly, the kind of kiss that knew it had time. And Robert appeared in the doorway behind them and observed this with his usual gravity, and then went away again, apparently satisfied by whatever he had assessed. The harvest of 1877 was the best yet. The south acreage had gone in as planned. James Collier had filed his homestead claim in the spring, and had land of his own 2 miles east, but continued to work with them through a labor-sharing arrangement that benefited both sides. And the Schroeder's eldest son, Peter, who was 20 and very capable, had come on as a part-time hand. The grain buyer in Caldwell gave them a price that made Harriet's careful arithmetic look very good indeed, and she sat with the ledger that evening after the children were in bed and showed Henry the year's numbers with an expression that was not smug exactly, but was the specific satisfaction of someone who planned carefully and then watched the plan perform. "South acreage again next year," she said, "and the north drainage field if the channel improvement holds." "The channel improvement will hold," he said. "Novik and I set that stone ourselves." "I know," she said. "That's why I said it will hold." He smiled. She pulled the ledger across the table and wrote something in the margin and then looked up and said, "Henry." "Yes," he said. "I want to teach school." He processed this. "Here. There are 11 children within riding distance of here," she said. "The Novik children, the Schroeder children, James Collier's nephew who came out in June, the Burgess children. None of them are getting proper schooling. The Caldwell school is too far for the younger ones. And you want to establish a school here," he said. "I want to teach them," she said. 2 days a week in this house until we can build something proper. I have the books. I know how to teach." He looked at her. He thought about what she had said once, that making something out of what her father started was what she wanted. He thought about how she talked to James about the homestead process, and how she had spent half an evening explaining soil drainage to young Peter Schroeder, and how Robert already knew his letters at 2.5, because she talked to him constantly as if he was already capable of understanding complicated things, which had the effect of making him actually capable of understanding complicated things. 2 days a week, he said, and I manage the field planning those days. You manage the field planning regardless, she said. We both know that. I manage it with your input, he said. Yes, she agreed. That is the correct description. The school started in October of 1877. 9 children around the Whitaker kitchen table twice a week. And within a month, Harriet had a waiting list because the word had spread to farms further out. And by spring, she was writing to the county education office about proper facilities and funding. And by the fall of 1878, there was a small schoolhouse built on the northeast corner of the Whitaker property, on land Harriet donated from her portion of the combined acreage. And she taught 4 days a week, and the county paid her a modest salary that she put directly into a fund she was maintaining for. She told Henry when he asked something specific, but not yet ready to discuss. He waited, because he had learned that her unready things always resolved into something worth waiting for. The something turned out to be a library. Not a large one, by any standard anyone who had seen a real library would apply, but real nonetheless. 63 volumes ordered through Caldwell's General Store over the course of 2 years, arranged on shelves that Henry built in the schoolhouse, available to any child or adult within reaching distance of the place. Harriet wrote a list of every book in a ledger with the same precision she applied to the grain records, cataloging by subject and author, and on the day the last of the 63 arrived and she shelved it, she stood back and looked at the shelves and said nothing for a while. Henry, who had brought the books over from town in the wagon, stood behind her and looked at the shelves with her. "Your father would have liked this too," he said. She nodded slowly. "He would have been in it every day," she said. "He was the kind of man who wanted to understand everything." "I know where Robert gets it," Henry said. She turned and looked at him, and her face was full and happy and entirely itself. The controlled precision and the warmth and the intelligence and the gray eyes that he had been looking into for 4 years now and still found inexhaustible. "Robert gets it from both of us," she said. He could not argue with that. The years settled into the rhythm of what they had built, which was a life that was full in the practical sense. The wheat and the land and the hired hands and the school and the library and the children and the neighbors. And also full in the other sense that is harder to describe, but that both of them were aware of every day in the way you are aware of things that are fundamental to how you breathe. In 1879, they had a third child, another boy they named William, who came into the world with his father's brown hair and his grandmother Clara's reportedly formidable voice, and who was, from his first months, a person of vigorous opinions and enthusiastic engagement with everything he encountered. He and Clara, who was 3 when William arrived, established an alliance immediately that Robert observed from his position of thoughtful elder sibling with what appeared to be philosophical acceptance. Henry was 36 in 1879. He was not old, but he was no longer the young man who had ridden onto empty grassland with a deed and an emptiness in his chest. And the difference was not just the years, but what the years had contained. He had land that was producing, a house that was real, children who were growing into people, a wife who was the most interesting person he had ever known, and whose capacity for surprising him had not diminished at all. He had neighbors he trusted and work that meant something, and mornings when he rode the field lines in the early light and felt the specific satisfaction of a life that was coherent, that added up. He still kept the deed in his breast pocket. The creases were almost entirely worn away now, and the paper was so soft it barely made a sound when he unfolded it. He did not unfold it very often anymore. He did not need to reassure himself it was real. The realness of his life was evident in every direction he looked. One evening in the fall of 1879, with the harvest in and the new wheat planted and the children in bed and the house quiet, he and Harriet sat on the porch in the autumn dark. It was cool but not yet cold, and the stars were the brilliant extravagance they always were over the open plains, and the smell of new-turned earth and autumn grass was in the air. She had her feet tucked up in a shawl around her shoulders and a glass of the decent whiskey that was now a regular purchase rather than a special occasion expense, and he sat beside her and they were quiet in the way they were quiet now, which was the comfortable silence of people who have said most of what they need to say and know that more will come. "I've been thinking about something," she said. "Tell me," he said. "The Schroeder girl, Anna. She's 21 now and she's been helping me at the school since last fall. She has a gift for it. "I've noticed," he said. "I want to recommend her to the county as a second teacher," she said. "Which means I could reduce my days and spend more time on the farm records. The operation has gotten complex enough that half my teaching days I'm thinking about whether the supply ledger is current." He looked at her. "Is that what you want, to leave the teaching?" "Not leave it," she said. "Share it. There's a difference." She paused. "I want to build something further. The school can grow, the library can grow, but I need time for both." "Then talk to the county," he said. "I intend to," she said. "I wanted to tell you first." He took her hand. "You don't need to tell me first," he said. "You don't need my permission for anything, Harriet." "I know I don't need it," she said. "I want it." "Those are different things, too." He turned to look at her in the starlight, and she looked back with the gray eyes that were the clearest thing in his world, and he thought about all the differences she had made. Not just to the land, which was blooming, not just to the house, which was real, not just to the community around them, which was growing, but to him, to the person who had been riding around with an emptiness in his chest, and a deed he kept touching as if it would eventually tell him something. She had told him something. She had made it true. "Harriet," he said. "Henry," she said, with the slight edge of warmth in it that was hers alone. "I love you," he said, which was not something he said in those exact words very often because he tended to express it in the 100 daily ways that were more natural to him, but which it was important to say plainly sometimes. "I know you do," she said. "I love you." She leaned against him and he put his arm around her, and the autumn night was around them, and the land was dark and full and entirely itself, and the life they had made was all the directions they could see. Inside the house, Robert made a sound in his sleep and then was quiet. Clara's voice said something brief and unintelligible, and then that was quiet too. William, who was 4 months old and developing very strong opinions about sleep, was, for the moment, silent. The porch boards were solid under their feet. The roof above them did not leak. The fields were resting under their thin covering of young wheat, and in the spring they would come up green again, and in the summer gold, and in August they would cut them and count them and plan the next year, and the year after that, and all the years of a life that was very full of what it was supposed to be full of. Henry Whitaker reached into his breast pocket and took out the deed. He unfolded it, which took a moment because it was very soft now, and he looked at it in the starlight, and then he handed it to Harriet. She took it and read it, though she had read it before, and then she looked at him. "You keep it," he said. "You always knew what it was for better than I did." She looked at the paper and then at him, and something moved across her face that was quiet and private and entirely sufficient. She folded it carefully with her practiced precise hands and held it for a moment. Then she leaned up and kissed him, warm and certain in the autumn dark. "We keep it," she said, "together." She put it in the pocket of her shawl, close to her heart where it stayed. The stars went their ancient way across the Kansas sky, and the land lay rich and dark and ready all the way to every horizon, and it meant something now. It had been meaning something for years, quietly and abundantly and without fanfare, the way the best things do, building season by season into a life that was whole.